deep inside a mountain in Switzerland, sealed behind blast doors that weigh more than a fully loaded Boeing 747, sit over 1,000 aircraft. Spitfires, Messerschmitts, American B-17 bombers, German Heinkel fighters, enemies in life, neighbors in death. Some of them have never been touched since the pilots who flew them walked away. Some still have ammunition in their guns. And almost nobody on Earth knows exactly what is in there. This is not a museum, it is not a graveyard. It is something far stranger than either. It is a living archive of the most violent conflict in human history, preserved in the cold, dry, oxygen-controlled air of the Swiss Alps, waiting for what? Nobody is entirely sure. But here is the most shocking part. This vault does not belong to a government. It does not belong to a military. It belongs to private collectors, aviation historians, and a small network of extraordinarily wealthy individuals who have spent decades quietly acquiring some of the rarest aircraft ever built. And the Swiss mountain did not choose them by accident. It chose them because Switzerland is the only country in the world where you can park a Nazi fighter plane next to a Royal Air Force Spitfire and nobody will arrest you for it. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to the war itself. Back to the burning skies over Europe, back to a time when these aircraft were not artifacts. They were weapons. Between 1939 and 1945, the air forces of the world built over 800,000 aircraft. 800,000. The United States alone produced 300,000 planes in just 4 years, roughly one every 3 minutes around the clock, 7 days a week. The British produced 130,000. Germany built 120,000, Japan 76,000, the Soviet Union over 100,000. These were not gentle machines, these were instruments of mass destruction, built at a scale the world had never seen and has never seen since. And when the war ended, almost all of them were destroyed. Not by enemy fire, not by accident, by deliberate policy. The victorious Allied powers made a calculated decision. Surplus aircraft were melted down, scrapped, pushed off the sides of aircraft carriers into the Pacific Ocean, buried in desert boneyards, and stripped for parts. The logic was cold, but simple. Keep these planes intact, and some future conflict might put them back in the air. Destroy them, and the war truly ends. In the months after VJ Day in 1945, the United States scrapped over 35,000 aircraft. 35,000. Many of them had fewer than 50 flight hours. Some were brand new, still in their packing crates. The result was one of the greatest acts of industrial destruction in peacetime history. Within a decade, most of what had filled the skies of Europe and the Pacific was gone. The Spitfire, which helped save Britain in 1940, had been built in just 20,338 examples. By 1955, fewer than 100 were known to survive. The North American P-51 Mustang, arguably the finest fighter of the entire war, had been produced in over 15,000 units. By the mid-1950s, fewer than 150 remained. The German Messerschmitt Bf-109, which had dominated European skies from Poland to Stalingrad, was built in over 33,000 examples, more than any other fighter in history. Today, fewer than 70 survive worldwide. The reality was even more shocking than anyone anticipated. These machines, which had changed the course of history, were vanishing. And once they were gone forever. But here's what nobody expected. Some people were saving them. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, a small number of collectors, mechanics, ex-military pilots, engineers, and obsessives began quietly acquiring surplus aircraft before the scrappers could reach them. They paid almost nothing. A P-51 Mustang in 1946 could be bought for less than $2,000. A B-17 Flying Fortress, which had cost the United States government over $200,000 to build, was selling at auction for $750. The men buying these planes were not rich, they were simply faster than the wrecking crews. They stored them in barns, in hangars, on private airstrips in the American Midwest and the English countryside. And as the decades passed, and the aircraft grew rarer, their value exploded. By the 1980s, that $2,000 Mustang was worth $500,000. By the 2000s, it was worth $2 million. By 2024, a single, airworthy P-51 Mustang in original wartime configuration sold at auction for $4.8 million. The aircraft had become treasure. And treasure needs protecting. This is where Switzerland enters the story. And to understand why Switzerland, you need to understand something about the country that most people never think about. Switzerland has no wartime history of aggression. It was neutral in both world wars. It has no legislation restricting the private ownership of wartime aircraft, regardless of which side built them. It has no cultural taboo about preserving German military hardware alongside Allied machines. Its mountain geography offers naturally stable temperatures, low humidity, and perfect preservation conditions. And its financial secrecy laws, which have protected private banking for centuries, extend in practice to private collections. Nobody audits what is behind a Swiss vault door. The Swiss also built something else that matters enormously to this story. The Sonnenberg Tunnel in Lucerne, completed in 1976, is the largest civilian nuclear shelter in the world. It was built to house 20,000 people in the event of nuclear war. But Switzerland dug dozens of other military tunnels throughout the 20th century, many of them built into the faces of the Alps as part of the National Redoubt strategy, the Swiss plan to withdraw the entire army into mountain fortresses if Switzerland were ever invaded. When the Cold War ended, many of these tunnels became surplus. The Swiss government sold some of them, others were quietly leased, and a handful were converted into something nobody had anticipated: private storage facilities for extremely valuable, extremely large objects. Aircraft fit perfectly into a Cold War military tunnel. The ceiling height is generous. The temperature is stable at around 12 degrees Celsius year-round. The humidity is controlled. The blast doors, built to withstand nuclear overpressure, make conventional security look like a screen door. And the location, high in the Alps, far from any urban center, surrounded by mountains, accessible only by a single road that can be watched from a kilometer away in every direction, is about as secure as a storage facility can be without being orbital. The first wartime aircraft arrived in what insiders simply call the Vault in the late 1980s. A German collector, whose identity has never been publicly confirmed, arranged to move 3 aircraft into the tunnel after purchasing them from an estate in the American Southwest. One was a Focke-Wulf FW-190, the German fighter that had terrorized Allied bombers over France and Germany from 1941 onward. One was a partial Junkers Ju-88, the twin-engine German bomber that had bombed London, Coventry, Malta, and Leningrad. And one was, astonishingly, a near-complete Heinkel He-111, the medium bomber that had led the Blitz, raining incendiary bombs on British cities throughout the winter of 1940 and 1941. All 3 aircraft had been exported from Europe in the late 1940s, purchased by American collectors, and had sat in climate-controlled storage in New Mexico for nearly 40 years. They were not airworthy. They were not displayed publicly. They simply existed, preserved in the dry desert air, waiting. Now they came to the mountain. Within 5 years, word spread among the tight, secretive community of serious wartime aviation collectors. The tunnel existed. It was secure. It was discreet. The Swiss custodians who managed it asked no questions about the provenance of the aircraft, applied no restrictions on what could be stored there, and charged handsomely for the privilege. But compared to the rising market value of the aircraft themselves, the storage fees were trivial. The collection grew slowly at first, then faster, then remarkably fast. Through the 1990s, aircraft arrived from across Europe, from the United States, from Australia, from South America. A Royal Air Force Hawker Hurricane, one of only a handful surviving in anything close to original condition. 2 Supermarine Spitfires, both acquired from private British estates. A Curtiss P-40 Warhawk in original American volunteer group markings, the famous Flying Tigers paint scheme with the shark mouth that had terrified Japanese pilots over China and Burma. A Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber, the aircraft that had turned the tide of the Pacific War at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, sinking 4 Japanese fleet carriers in a single morning and changing the course of the war in one catastrophic 6-minute attack. Did you know that the SBD Dauntless dive bomber, despite being considered obsolete by the US Navy before the war, sank more Japanese shipping than any other Allied aircraft? The aircraft that admirals wanted to retire became the weapon that won the Pacific. Each aircraft that arrived at the vault came with its own story, its own history, its own ghosts. But then something remarkable happened. German aircraft began arriving alongside Allied ones. This was not, in the world of serious aviation preservation, particularly controversial. Among collectors and historians, a Messerschmitt is not a symbol of Nazi ideology. It is a machine, an engineering achievement, a piece of history that belongs to everyone who seeks to understand what the 20th century did to the world. The politics of 1939 do not determine the historical significance of 1944, but the optics were undeniably extraordinary. By the late 1990s, the tunnel contained aircraft from 6 nations: Britain, the United States, Germany, Japan, Italy, and France. Victors and vanquished, bombers and fighters, aircraft that had shot at each other over the English Channel, now sat wingtip to wingtip in the same alpine darkness, covered in the same climate-controlled air, attended by the same Swiss technicians in the same grey overalls. To walk the length of the vault, and only a handful of people have ever been permitted to do so, is to walk through the entire aerial history of the Second World War in a single pass. You begin at the entrance, where the blast doors are thick enough to stop a direct artillery round. Beyond them, the tunnel opens into a space roughly 180 meters long and 22 meters wide, with a ceiling height of just over 8 meters. The lighting is cool and even, designed not to fade paint or degrade rubber components. The floor is smooth concrete, marked with the yellow lines of a very unusual parking lot. And then you see them, row upon row of aircraft, arranged by size, with the smallest at the edges and the larger bombers anchored to reinforced floor fittings in the center lanes. The fighters come first, a line of Spitfires, 3 of them in original camouflage, one in the ocean grey and dark sea grey of Coastal Command, one in the desert pink and sand of North Africa, each one covered in a thin conservation coat, each one with its propeller blades wrapped in soft cloth to prevent microabrasion. Beside them, separated by perhaps 3 meters of aisle space, a line of German aircraft, 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, both in late-war Reichsverteidigung markings, the mottled grey and green of home defence, a Focke-Wulf FW-190D9, the long-nosed Dora variant introduced in 1944 to combat the Allied bombing offensive, considered by many historians to be the finest German piston engine fighter of the war. 3 meters of concrete, that is all that separates enemies. Further into the tunnel, the aircraft grow larger. A de Havilland Mosquito, the British twin-engine aircraft built almost entirely from wood, laminated birch and spruce, bonded with adhesive, that was faster than most German fighters and served as a bomber, a night fighter, a pathfinder, a photo reconnaissance aircraft, and a low-level precision attack platform. The Mosquito was perhaps the most versatile aircraft of the entire war. There are fewer than 30 in existence anywhere in the world. The vault contains 2. Across the aisle, a Dornier Do-17, the German twin-engine bomber known as the Flying Pencil for its extraordinarily slim fuselage. The Do-17 participated in the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and the siege of Malta. It was withdrawn from frontline service in 1942, replaced by more capable aircraft. Only one other example is known to survive anywhere in the world. The aircraft recovered from the seabed of Goodwin Sands off the English coast in 2013 and now under restoration at the RAF Museum. The vault's example is more complete, though not airworthy. Then come the Americans. The centerpiece of the American collection within the vault is a B-17G Flying Fortress. It is enormous. Even inside the tunnel, which has been specifically sized to accommodate large aircraft, the B-17's 31-meter wingspan forces it to sit at an angle, its wingtips nearly touching the tunnel walls on both sides. The aircraft is in its original 8th Air Force livery, the olive drab and neutral grey of the daylight bombing campaign over Europe. The nose art, a woman in red painted in the style of the Memphis Belle era, is faded but legible. The ball turret, the small glass sphere mounted under the fuselage where a gunner would sit in almost unimaginable claustrophobia and cold, is still intact. The turret's twin .50 caliber machine guns are present, but deactivated, their breeches removed, stored in a sealed case mounted to the aircraft's interior bulkhead. This particular B-17 flew 31 combat missions over Germany between 1943 and 1944. Of its original 10-man crew, 4 did not survive the war. The aircraft survived every mission, was declared surplus in 1945, was sold to a private operator in South America, was used to carry cargo across the Andes for 12 years, was acquired by an American collector in 1962, and has been in various stages of conservation ever since. It is one of approximately 46 B-17 known to survive worldwide, and one of perhaps 9 that retain anything close to their original wartime configuration. Did you know that during the height of the American bombing campaign over Germany in 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing an average of 30 aircraft per mission? Each aircraft carried 10 men. On Black Thursday, October 14, 1943, the second Schweinfurt raid, the 8th Air Force lost 60 aircraft in a single day, 600 men, gone in hours. The B-17 in the vault flew through that campaign and came home. To stand beneath its wing in the tunnel is to feel something difficult to name. Not nostalgia, not exactly grief. Something more specific than either, the weight of a particular kind of survival. Beyond the B-17, the tunnel continues. There are aircraft here that most aviation historians have never seen and may not know exist. A Machi C-202 Folgore, the Italian fighter that challenged Allied air superiority over the Mediterranean and North Africa, with a performance that routinely surprised American and British pilots who had underestimated Italian engineering. A Mitsubishi A6M0, a genuine Zero, not a post-war replica, not a rebuild, acquired from an estate in the United States where it had been stored since 1947 after being recovered as a trophy aircraft from the Pacific. The Zero is perhaps the most famous Japanese aircraft of the war, the symbol of Japan's early aerial dominance, the plane that attacked Pearl Harbor. There are fewer than 24 Zeros known to survive anywhere on Earth. This one's rising sun markings are original paint, applied at the Mitsubishi factory in Nagoya sometime in 1942. The custodians of the vault will not confirm the total number of aircraft. The figure most often cited by those with indirect knowledge of the collection is somewhere between 900 and 1,100 individual aircraft, ranging from complete airframes in conservation quality condition to partial wrecks and significant components, wings, engines, fuselages, that represent types with no other known survivors. If that figure is accurate, the vault contains by itself the largest single collection of Second World War aircraft on Earth. The National Air and Space Museum's Udvar-Hazy Center, the largest aviation museum in the United States, holds approximately 200 aircraft of all eras. The RAF Museum across its 2 sites holds around 100. The Smithsonian's entire wartime aircraft collection numbers fewer than 50. The vault, in a mountain in Switzerland that does not appear on tourist maps, holds more than all of them combined. The question that follows from this fact is obvious. Who owns these aircraft? Who pays for their conservation? And what happens to them when their owners die? The answers are complicated, occasionally disputed, and in some cases genuinely unknown. The vault operates as a private consortium. There is no single owner. There is no board of directors with a public-facing structure. There is a small management company, registered in Zurich, that handles the administrative and conservation side of the operation. The individual aircraft are owned by perhaps 40 or 50 private individuals and small foundations, most of them European, some American, a handful from the Middle East and Asia. Some of the owners are themselves aviation historians with deep academic credentials. Some are industrialists with a passion for mechanical history. Some are, frankly, wealthy people who treat rare aircraft the way other people treat rare art, as objects of beauty, of historical resonance, and of considerable financial value. The conservation work is carried out by a permanent staff of 12 technicians, supplemented by specialist consultants brought in for specific aircraft and specific problems. The work is meticulous and ongoing. Aircraft at this level of rarity are never truly static. Paint continues to degrade. Rubber deteriorates. Metal corrodes even in controlled conditions. Leather disintegrates. Fabric tears. The technicians rotate through the collection on a 3-year cycle, inspecting, stabilizing, and conserving each aircraft in turn. One technician, a Swiss woman in her 50s who trained as a textile conservator before transitioning to aircraft, has spent the last 8 years working exclusively on the fabric control surfaces, the ailerons, the elevators, the rudders of the collection's fighter aircraft. The fabric on a 1940s fighter, she has explained in the only interview she has ever given, is as delicate as old linen. You can breathe wrong and damage it. But here is the question that haunts every serious conversation about the vault, every discussion among aviation historians, every policy meeting at national museums that have heard the rumors and wished they hadn't. What happens next? Because these aircraft are extraordinary. They are irreplaceable. They are, in many cases, the last physical evidence of one of the most significant chapters in human history. They carry the fingerprints of the engineers who built them, the mechanics who serviced them, the pilots who flew them into combat. They are primary sources. They are the equivalent of original manuscripts, or ancient artifacts, or archaeological sites. They cannot be reproduced. Once they are gone, the physical reality of what happened in those skies is gone with them, and they are in a mountain where nobody can see them. The argument made by the collectors who own them is not trivial. Museum environments, they contend, are genuinely damaging to aircraft. Visitor traffic creates humidity fluctuations. Artificial lighting degrades paint. Display mounting puts stress on airframes not designed to be suspended or mounted on poles. The British, Americans, Germans, and French who own aircraft in national museums have watched those aircraft visibly deteriorate over decades, while the aircraft in the vault have remained stable. Conservation, they argue, must come before display. The aircraft can always be exhibited later. They cannot be uncorroded. There is something to this. But there is also something deeply uncomfortable about the idea that the last surviving Machi C-202, the last Dornier Do-17, in anything close to original condition. The last examples of aircraft types that shaped the world are sitting in the dark behind a blast door that requires a 6-digit code to open, owned by people whose names are not publicly attached to them, unavailable for scholarship, unavailable for education, unavailable for the children and grandchildren of the people who built and flew and died in them. Did you know that approximately 70% of all Second World War aircraft types are now entirely extinct? Not a single example survives anywhere in the world. The Heinkel, a 177 Greif, Germany's only strategic heavy bomber, was built in over 1,000 units. Not one survives. The Avro Manchester, the predecessor to the legendary Lancaster, was built in over 200 examples. Not one survives. The Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, Japan's finest late-war fighter, considered by many American pilots who encountered it in combat to be superior to anything the US fielded in 1944, was built in over 3,500 examples. Fewer than 4 survive. For most aircraft types, the question is not how many survive. The question is whether any survive at all. The vault may contain examples of types previously believed extinct. The management company has confirmed nothing, but people who have been inside have spoken carefully, in private, about aircraft that do not match any known surviving inventory, about fuselage shapes that should not exist, about engine nacelles and wing configurations that belong to types written off as completely lost. If true, and this remains unverified, the implications are staggering. The vault would not merely be the largest collection of Second World War aircraft on Earth, it would be the only place on Earth where certain chapters of the war's aerial history can still be read in physical form. And it would be sitting behind a blast door that most of the world does not know exists. There have been attempts to change this. In the early 2000s, a consortium of European aviation museums, led by the RAF Museum and the Musée de l'Air et de l'Espace in Paris, began quiet diplomatic contact with the management company and several known owners, exploring the possibility of long-term loan arrangements that would allow specific aircraft to be displayed publicly. The conversations were polite. They were also entirely unsuccessful. The owners were not hostile. They were simply uninterested. The aircraft were where they needed to be. In 2009, a British aviation heritage organisation attempted a different approach, working through Swiss legal channels to establish whether any of the aircraft in the collection might have been unlawfully acquired, looted from occupied countries during the war, taken from families who had never consented to their sale, exported in violation of cultural heritage regulations. The legal effort identified several aircraft whose provenance was ambiguous. The ownership trail grew murky in the late 1940s, the records incomplete in the way that wartime records always are. But ambiguous is not the same as illegal, and the investigation ultimately produced no actionable findings. The aircraft stayed. The world's governments, it turns out, have almost no legal leverage over a private collection, stored in a neutral country by owners who have broken no law that anyone can demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt. And so the vault continues. The mountain holds its breath. The aircraft sit in their rows, wingtip to wingtip, enemies at rest. The Spitfire and the Messerschmitt, 3 meters apart. The B-17 and the Heinkel, perhaps 10 meters separating them. The Zero and the Dauntless, which once circled each other at altitude over the Pacific while their pilots tried to kill each other, now neighbored in the dark. Somewhere inside that tunnel, there are aircraft that no living person has ever publicly seen. Aircraft that belong, by any moral reckoning, to the history of every country that fought in that war, which is to say, nearly every country on Earth. Aircraft that carry in their rivets and their paint and their scorched engine cowlings the evidence of what humans did to each other between 1939 and 1945. And here is the final and most disturbing fact of all. The oldest of the collectors who own these aircraft are in their 80s and 90s. Their collections will pass to heirs who may not share their passion, or their patience, or their conviction that preservation in darkness is a form of honour. Estates will be settled, legal structures will be unwound, aircraft will be sold or donated or moved, or, in the worst case, simply left to whatever care heirs consider sufficient. The world may get to see these aircraft, or the mountain may keep them forever. Deep in the Alps, in the cold and the dark and the carefully controlled air, 1,000 aircraft wait. They do not know which side won. They do not know that the war ended. They do not know that the pilots who flew them are almost all dead now, most of them taking their memories with them. They simply exist, preserved against time, against entropy, against the forgetting that eventually takes everything. 1,000 aircraft, one mountain, zero certainty about what comes next. And somewhere in that tunnel, behind the last row of fighters, in the deepest part of the vault where the lighting is lowest and the temperature is coldest, something sits under a canvas cover that the custodians have never photographed, that the management company has never catalogued in any document that has reached the outside world, that belongs to a part of the collection whose owner died in 2017 and whose estate has still not been settled. Nobody knows what it is. Nobody is allowed to look.